Last time on the Discover the Word podcast, New Testament scholar and professor Dr. David Turner was at the table with the Discover the Word group, leading a study called Prophecy, Prophets, and Jesus, showing how in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is presented as Israel's last and greatest prophet. Some highlights from that first week.
We have this popular idea that prophets are about predictions, so they're not that different from meteorologists who tell us what the weather's going to be.
That's good.
So I guess the thing I want us to think about here is that prophets weren't just throwing predictions out. They were speaking for God through His Holy Spirit. I'm trying to get away from the word prediction when it comes to the prophets. I want to use the word promise.
Yeah, the prophet's message from God was primary, but the predictions, better promises, were important because, as David said,
what holds history together? When we look at Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy of Jesus, history is held together by promises God made.
That's a really powerful phrase you just said. History is held together by these promises and God's work through these promises.
Yeah, that was an important line. All of history is held together by God's promises. Another important observation about Jesus fulfilling the prophecies, predictions, promises made about the Messiah.
There are footprints in the sand on the beach of history that Israel has made, and Jesus puts His feet right back into those footprints.
Yeah, if you missed part 1, I would encourage you to listen to it. It built an important foundation. But now it's time to head into part 2 of our study of prophecy, prophets, and Jesus with Dr. David Turner. All right, so peanut butter and jelly, salt and pepper, bacon and eggs, those things we kind of pair together, don't we? And we also pair people together. Batman and Robin, Romeo and Juliet. Can you think of others? And if you were going to pair another prophet with Jesus, who would that be? Well, today, as Dr. David Turner continues this conversation with Elisa Morgan, Daniel Ryan Day, and Rasul Berry, he shows us how Matthew connects Jesus with another prophet that may at first kind of surprise us.
So we're thinking this week more explicitly and directly about Jesus as prophet, and we find that He says in Matthew chapter 5 that He did not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill. So we're going to look in this session into Matthew chapter 5 carefully. And I guess one way to get us thinking about it is think about pairs of people that we know about in our culture, such as the old comedians Abbott and Costello, or the cartoons about Woody and Buzz, and the comic strips about Calvin and Hobbes. And you think about in the Bible Elijah and Elisha, or you think about David and Jonathan, or you think about Paul and Timothy. Would you ever think about Jesus and Moses in those terms?
It's interesting.
Yeah, that just kind of got my mind going. I kept going like BB and CC Winans.
Yeah. You're thinking
Hall and Oates. My mind just kept,
Mario and Luigi.
Dan and Shay.
But yeah, Jesus and Moses, I think my initial answer would have been no in terms of my initial experiences of Christian circles seeing more of an opposition because it was like the law versus grace. But as I've gotten to have more exposure and appreciation for kind of Jesus, what He means by I came to fulfill the law, not to abolish it, I think there is more synergy there.
Yeah, but one of the things that's interesting about all the people we just mentioned is they're like same time frame, interacted with each other.
True.
And we think about Jesus and Moses living, at least Jesus as human,
Right.
living at very different times, different places.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem as obvious as, I get exactly what you're saying, Rasul.
And yet when you look at the big story of the Bible, you see Moses and the Exodus, the journey to freedom, and you see Jesus and a new Exodus and the journey to freedom. There is this arc of the story, this theme of setting people free, truly. Moses did it in the law, and then Jesus ultimately completes that work. So in that way, yes, David.
Yeah, that's good. I think when we begin to hear the terms, at least in my background in church, when you hear people talk about law and grace, what they're talking about is legalism versus freedom. And often it's put that folks who were under the law were totally, it was all about them and their performance, and they did stuff that merited God accepting them and giving them a home in heaven. Whereas finally in Jesus we get away from that idea, and we're living under grace, which unfortunately sometimes becomes license to do whatever you want to do. Once saved, always saved, no matter what. It doesn't matter because we're under grace. The problem with that is I think it misunderstands what's going on here in Matthew 5, which after Jesus gives the general point that he didn't come to destroy but to fulfill in verses 17 to 20, he gives 6 examples.
Should we read those verses 17 to 20, David?
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Okay, Matthew 5:17. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven.
And this sets us up to understand the 6 examples that Jesus gives, which are along the lines of, you heard that it was said, but I say. And often that but in there is sort of the law and grace thing, like they're antithetical, they're opposites. But if there's any opposition here, it isn't between Jesus and Moses, it's between Jesus and the Pharisees. Because we learn that at there verse 20 or so, that your righteousness has to exceed them. So you heard it said that you shouldn't murder. Okay, great. You can't congratulate yourself if you didn't murder anybody today if you've been mad at your coworker all day. Because anger leads to murder. You can't congratulate yourself just because you haven't committed adultery if you're addicted to porn and you watch it, on the internet. So it comes down to the inner heart of the person as opposed to the outward act. So you look at these 6 examples: anger and murder, lust and adultery, divorce apart from infidelity, going into all this trivial stuff about whether an oath is binding or not, which also comes up in chapter 23, vengeance and loving your enemies, not just your friends. All of this is Jesus telling us what the ultimate original intention that God had when he gave the law. This is not Jesus correcting Moses. This is Jesus telling us what Moses meant all along and saying that the Pharisees are the ones who messed this up. So Moses and I, we're one, but it's the Pharisees who've garbled things. So people want to gang up Moses and the Pharisees against Jesus. That's wrong. What we're doing here is connecting Jesus to Moses and saying we got to get away from the Pharisaic tradition, which is focused on things that aren't really true at the heart of the law. This becomes a big deal again in Matthew 23, which we'll look at in a few days.
I think about one of the clearest examples of that in Matthew 19, when the Pharisees try to very artfully issue this question of divorce. Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? It says in Matthew 19:3, and he answered, have you not read from the beginning? He appeals to Moses in Genesis, male and female, that therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, hold fast to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. So then they say, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? And he said to them, because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed, not commanded, you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you. And I think that's the distinction that you're drawing. That he said, really no, you're trying to appeal to Moses. That's not what Moses said. And he affirms the actual ethic of the law.
Yeah. Yeah, if you go back to that passage, I think it's Deuteronomy 24, there's like, if this happens, and if this happens, and if this, and if this, and if this, and if this, then you can get a divorce. So the Pharisees took that very specific, it's called case law, that very specific situation, and they broadened it as if it was a global command that referred to everything. So that's how they were reading the Old Testament. But Jesus read it in a very different way. He just went back to Genesis and said, that's not the way it's supposed to be. God's a God of grace. He forgives. He repairs relationships. Sometimes marriages end, unfortunately. But that's not the original plan. The plan is for a couple to be together forever. Doesn't always work that way, and God's grace comes in. So Jesus is talking about we might call the created order, and why this is the way things should be. And if you think about it that way, then you think very differently about divorce.
I do also think, David, as we're talking about this, like it's easy to kind of gang up on the Pharisees and give them a hard time. I just wonder if they were sitting at the table with us, how they would push back on us. Like, would they say, no, we wanted a good relationship with God, and this is the way that we thought it worked?
Yeah, well, I think Jesus kept many of the Pharisaic traditions, and I don't think the Pharisaic traditions in and of themselves are the issue. The issue is, what is your heart attitude when you do all these traditions? Do you think I'm doing this and now I've become someone? So I do it so that people can look at me and say, oh, look at so-and-so. He's really a godly person. That's what Jesus seems to get at in Matthew 23. And one of the most shocking statements in Matthew there about the Pharisees is Jesus says they sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, do what they tell you, but don't do what they do. In other words, listen to their Torah interpretations, do it from a heart of love, but don't follow their example, because everything they do to be seen by other people. They're virtue signaling, to use a current expression.
And that's really what Matthew 6 is about too. Evidently, Jesus thinks that's potential for all of us. Beware of practicing your piety before others to be seen by them, right? So like, beware in how you give, how you pray, how you fast, not to be doing it just so that others look at you and think about how spiritual you are.
Yeah. So here in chapter 5, we hear Jesus speaking about not coming to abolish but to fulfill. We understand, or at least we think we do, what that means when he says, I did not come to abolish but to fulfill the prophets. But the question is how Jesus the prophet fulfills the law. And he fulfills it by teaching it according to its original intent, and he fulfills it by perfectly obeying it himself.
Helpful start to part 2 of our study with Dr. David Turner of Prophecy, Prophets, and Jesus, based in the Gospel of Matthew. And David mentioned the virtue signaling that the religious leaders of Jesus' day were so intent on, that Jesus had some pretty strong words for. Well, for the next couple of conversations, they're going to a section of Matthew's account of Jesus' life where Jesus, in true prophet terms, addressed that and the underlying attitudes that were so dangerous. So next we skip ahead to Matthew chapter 23 to talk about something I'm pretty sure we all still have struggles with today.
The question I guess I would ask us as we begin, are you sensitive to when other people are doing what we call today virtue signaling? And does that make you mad? Or are you sort of prone to humble bragging yourself? and maybe your outrage against the virtue signalers is your own way of virtue signaling.
I think I'm really good at not humble bragging or virtue signaling. How's that?
I see what you did there.
Okay.
I don't want us to lose the little dig that David had right there when he said, or is your anger at those who virtual signal your way of virtue signaling?
Yeah, that's good.
When I first read Mere Christianity, and he had the chapter on pride, and,
Oh, boy.
and then at the very end, it was like, and if you really, are irritated by people who are proud, I was like, yeah, I am. Then that's because you're offended because you feel like you should be the center of attention and have pride yourself. And it was like the most boomerang. I actually put the book down. And I was like, wait a minute, what just happened? So yes, I have been prone to humble brag. And for those that don't know what that means, it's like
when Rasul shows up to record this week and he was drinking a lot of water. And we're all like, wow, you're drinking a lot of water. He's like, yeah, I ran this morning.
Exactly. Yes. Guilty as charged. Ran 3.5 miles.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's hard to know when we're bragging versus just sharing what's going on in our lives. It can really easily blur between the two, especially when we talk about things that we've achieved, or maybe for those of us who are parents, something our kids have done. There's a difference between sharing that with friends that we care about and celebrating those things. But then it can just so easily turn to, I'm sharing this with you because I want to draw attention to myself in a way that isn't just, look what great thing happened, look how great I am.
And virtue signaling is a subgroup of humble brag, where you're specifically trying to point to, look at how righteous or good I am, because I am doing this thing that I want people to see that I'm doing. So
running 3.5 miles in less than 30 minutes, that's virtue signaling.
No, that's humble brag.
That's humble brag.
If I do it in a way where I'm trying not to make it obvious that I'm bragging. Virtue signaling is more like, oh, I just emptied this plastic bottle. Where can I recycle this? Does anyone know? 'Cause I'm really into that. So that's where I'm wanting to send a message.
Gosh, we
to
need to have a
everybody.
small group just on this. Okay.
Yeah, I feel like you're going to have to bring us in, David,
Yeah,
because we're going to spend this whole time talking about how we humble brag.
Okay. Well, I did a post on my website on Matthew 6 a while back on this very matter. And you recall Matthew 6, Jesus talks about your charity and your prayers and your fasting. And he says, don't do it in front of people to be seen by them.
Yeah.
If you do, you have your reward.
Yeah.
So enjoy it while it lasts. But pretty soon the spotlight will go away and you'll have nothing. So practice your virtuous deeds for God and for God alone. So here in Matthew 23, this is really a heavy chapter.
Yeah, it is.
And this is a chapter where Jesus really comes after the religious leaders of Israel. He says that their efforts in making converts only lead more people to hell. He says their emphasis on obscure legal details leaves aside the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, faithfulness. And he says their focus on outward appearances rather than on inward realities. And that's getting down particularly to, I think, the humble brag matter. And then he says, finally, you've had a history of rejecting the prophets, and now you're about to reject me. So the chapter has been used by Christians in virtue signaling.
Yeah.
We're not like those Jews who have done all these things. We're better. We're Christians. We're the church. But what they miss out on is what Jesus says at the very beginning of the chapter. Practice and observe whatever they tell you, but don't do what they do. So I think we need to read all of this, not just as the way Jesus went after the religious leaders of his day, but as a warning that we don't become like them. Because if you've been around in the church very long, the very things that Jesus was criticizing and pronouncing woes upon the religious leaders for are still happening today in the church.
And I think about, too, this chapter being considered one of the most anti-Semitic chapters in the Bible, and the fact that it's been used by Christians and people who claim Christianity to cause great suffering to the Jewish people. And the irony of that, because, verse 23 that you mentioned, neglecting the weightier matters of the law, justice, and mercy, the very way that Christians have sometimes used this chapter is as unmerciful as you could.
Yeah.
And so, to your point, we're invited not to neglect all this or throw it away, but actually to go back to that heart of what it means to follow God through these laws.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is one of the major passages that Christians have used against Jewish people through the years. Jesus wasn't speaking against the Jewish people. He was speaking prophetically to the leaders of Israel and saying, you guys have missed it. This is not what the prophets are all about. So Jesus is speaking prophetically to correct them. The prophets like Isaiah in the early chapters has a lot to say about Israel's doing all the sacrifices, and God says, I don't want any more burnt sacrifices. I want your heart. And if you start reading in Isaiah 5, leading up to the prophet Isaiah saying, woe to me, in chapter 6, there's a series of 7 woes, just like there are here in Matthew chapter 23. So Jesus is speaking very much like a prophet to Israel. And back in the day of Jesus, there were different sects within the nation. There were the scribes and Pharisees. There were the Sadducees. There was another group that probably we would call the Essenes, who, as far as we know, gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there was a lot of family squabbling going on within Judaism in New Testament times. And Jesus was speaking to the heart of Judaism. What does the Old Testament really teach? What did Moses really say?
Yeah, one of the things that I've heard that's kind of helped me understand the prophetic genre of literature is to recognize that they were the minority report, that these reformers of the nation, of the religious tradition, were oftentimes trying to address those who were in power politically, religiously. How do you think understanding that historical tradition and context helps us see what Jesus is doing here and its implications for us today?
Well, I think what it helps us do is understand that we need to be people of the whole Bible, not just the New Testament.
Right.
Jesus is correcting an understanding of the Old Testament that was very common then, and I think it's very common in the church today. Jesus is Israel's ultimate prophet. Jesus is speaking to them about what the Old Testament really is, and he's constantly referring to the Old Testament, and he's saying to us by doing that we are people of the whole Bible. Mm-hmm. We're not speaking merely as people of the New Testament. Often we contrast Old and New Testaments as if it's two different things entirely. Mm-hmm. You know, there's an old quote that's attributed to St. Augustine about the Old being revealed in the New and the New being concealed in the Old. In other words, there's a unity. We have indeed two testaments. We probably can't get around that language of Old and New Testaments. But the Old Testament isn't old in the sense of, decrepit.
Right.
It's an old, quaint antique, but, it's a nice-looking chair, but don't sit on it, it'll break.
Yeah, and the other thing, too, I think is really important, especially as we see these words and how strong they are, is Jesus is also in a part of the Jewish family and culture. He is Jewish. So he's an insider talking to insiders in a way that, I may have some really stressful things going on between me and a family member.
Right.
And I share those. But as soon as Rasul starts saying, you know what your cousin's like? He's like this. I might get really offended and angry, even though family. We might even be saying the same thing about my cousin, but I can talk about it, right? We're a part of the same family. And so I see that in this too. Jesus is a Jewish man, a rabbi, talking to other teachers of the law, of Pharisees. And he has the ability to critique in a way that us as non-Jewish people need to be really careful.
Yeah. So when we look at these pronouncements of woe against Israel, we don't want to minimize that.
Right.
That was warranted at the time. However, we want to make sure that it doesn't also come true of us. So probably the most important verses in the chapter for us are verses 8 to 12, where Jesus says, don't be like them. Don't insist on having this title. Instead, verse 11, the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted.
Yeah, humble brags and virtue signaling, that didn't begin with the advent of social media, although that probably hasn't made it any better. Jesus addressed that in true prophet form with the religious leaders of his day. And as David said, it's important that we not miss the message that Jesus prophesied there in Matthew 23. So more from this chapter in a moment as we continue our study called Prophecy, Prophets, and Jesus with Dr. David Turner here on Discover the Word. And while David is leading us through this study, I hope you will check out his book called Israel's Last Prophet, Jesus and the Jewish Leaders in Matthew 23. Now, it's based in this chapter of Matthew that we're focusing on in that last segment and the one coming up. But like our study took a significant amount of time setting up the context, this book also helps the reader process how Matthew positions Jesus as Israel's last great prophet. I think our study with Dr. Turner here on Discover the Word has given us a fresh way of reading the Gospel of Matthew, and this book will help you go even deeper on this approach. As we've been hearing, Dr. Turner shares a rather unique perspective because to be able to speak into this subject, he attended Hebrew Union College and the Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, where Jews and Christians together study biblical texts and their interpretations. And so the perspective that he comes from is probably a bit different than maybe you've heard before. Israel's Last Prophet by Dr. David Turner. You can search online booksellers for the best deal in either ebook or paperback form. That's Israel's Last Prophet by Dr. David Turner. Pastors, teachers, small group leaders, I think, would find this book really helpful reading. Now, a term we've been hearing a lot recently is cancel culture. Definition I found online described this way. Cancel culture is a cultural phenomenon in which an individual deemed to have acted or spoken in an unacceptable manner is ostracized, boycotted, shunned, fired, or assaulted, often aided by social media. It's probably part of why our world seems so divided today. Well, next we're going to see that prophets, including Jesus, often lived a cancel culture experience, minus, of course, the social media part. This cultural phenomenon isn't unique to our time in history. Many of the prophets throughout Israel's history were deemed to have spoken in an unacceptable manner, and they were canceled. So let's join the group at the table as David begins this important part of our study of prophecy, prophets, and Jesus.
So we've been looking at Matthew 23, the pronouncement of woes by Jesus upon the leaders of Israel, and noting that we are prone to the same thing in the church, so we should be the last people who point the finger at others. So we come now to the end of this chapter, verses 29 to 39, and we're looking at how Jesus explains how the whole history of Israel rejecting its prophets now comes to a sorry, sad conclusion in its rejection of him. So I guess I'd like to introduce it by thinking about the question of love and hate, the way they're used in pop culture today. If you say anything that is a shot across the bow of someone, that they think you hate them. They think if you love them, you only say positive things. So I'm thinking about contrasting that with what Paul said to the Galatians. Have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? So here's Jesus telling truth to Israel as their ultimate prophet.
Isn't this like maybe cancel culture? You know, if I disagree with you, you cancel me. You know, I'm not going to follow you anymore. I'm not going to listen to you anymore. You're bad. You're out of my life. And we've become so polarized by that.
Yeah, and I think the unfortunate thing about where we are in our lack of being able to have conversations with those we disagree with is love deepens through disagreement. Just agreeing with someone all the time, you don't ever develop the kind of respect and kindness and space for each other that you do when you disagree with someone and you still have a relationship with them. But by canceling it, we actually lose the opportunity for a deeper relationship.
Yeah, I kind of look at oftentimes these trends as kind of you could say pendulums that have swung too far in a certain direction. Like there was a time that this emphasis on speech that's supporting what people do or unconditional acceptance is trying to react to something in which it was normal to be offensive or to denigrate someone, and there didn't seem to be consequences with that. And so then, you know, people swing to the other side to try to actually say you can't say anything that disagrees with anything that somebody else feels or how they identify. And I think that we need to kind of find some context to not go to either extreme.
Yeah. So when we think about Matthew 23 here, we're finding Jesus. He has become the enemy of the leaders of Israel by prophetically telling them the truth. And it's a sad situation. And so the final woe that he pronounces upon them is woe to them for rejecting the prophets. And worse than that, they not only rejected the prophets, but they decorated the prophets' tombs that they had rejected. So Jesus alludes to them saying, well, if we had been alive back in that day, we wouldn't have taken part in killing the prophets like our ancestors did. And Jesus says, so you have unwittingly just implicated yourself in their guilt because the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You're just like them. You just haven't admitted it yet. So here's Jesus realizes that his ministry is nearly over. He's in the face of these people who realize he's trying to basically wipe out their power base just by teaching them that they're unethical. And so he says to them, go ahead, finish what your ancestors started. They murdered the prophets. I'm the ultimate prophet, so go ahead and kill me.
Wow.
And we see at the end of the chapter in his lament over Jerusalem and his weeping and saying, I would have drawn you many times like a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not. So there's the thing about the prophet. The prophet has to be loyal to God, even though it kills the prophet to speak negative about his people.
Yeah, it reminds me of earlier in the story when Jesus goes into his hometown and he makes the comment about prophets are never welcome in their hometown. And I think this is one of those passages that I think really preaches today, because I think all of us have a tendency to look back on the ugly parts of history and say, well, if I was in Germany,
Right.
I wouldn't have supported that. I would have stood up against it. Or way closer to home, if I had been during slave times, I wouldn't have been a part of the problem. I would have been a defender of people who were enslaved. And what Jesus is drawing attention to is, don't be so sure about what you think you would do back then. And that, man, that's a challenge, because we tend to look back on those people as if something was abnormally broken about them that I don't experience. And Jesus seems to be reflecting to all of us that we're all pretty broken if we look deep enough.
It's very sobering then to take these words to our hearts. And, what are our blind spots? Where am I completely oblivious to the fact that I am the problem too? It's real sobering.
Yeah. And I think that's where you see, and again, going back to the prophetic tradition, I think it's important to hold together both the strong statements and the energy of the woe with the lamentation of the O Jerusalem, O Jerusalem. And there's a sense in which even in the Old Testament, when the prophets picture God as a husband with an unfaithful spouse, like in Hosea, that level of emotion, you wouldn't expect a spouse to be like, oh yeah, you cheated on me. Oh, well, things happen. That's unfortunate. No, there's emotion there because of a covenant, a agreement, a life together. And so I think that's what's coming across too when Jesus is zeal for my house will consume me.
And it reminds me of, in our church, our Good Friday service, because all of us join the crowds in saying, crucify him. And it's us standing in solidarity with the fact that if we had been there in that time, we would not have heard Jesus talking and been the ones to try to defend him. Even his disciples ran away.
And Jesus is, I think, showing us the character of God here, that God does take umbrage at sin, and particularly hypocrisy, and God will judge hypocrites. At the same time, God laments. That's not where God's heart is. So it's not that God is in conflict. It's that our emotions and the emotions of the prophet mimic or mirror in some ways that of God himself. And another thing about the chapter that we need to mention is that in verses 34 to 36, Jesus is saying that I'm going to send you more prophets. And that's us. So he has said, he is the ultimate prophet. John the Baptist led up to Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate prophet, but just as in Deuteronomy 18, God said through Moses, I'm going to raise up a prophet like Moses. God is raising up prophets today like Jesus. And so this is where the church gains its own prophetic identity, which will be our last topic on Friday. We'll talk more about that. But the destiny of these people whom Jesus will send as prophets, wise men, and scribes is not rosy either. Some of them you will kill and crucify, some you will flog in your synagogues, so that the way you've treated me goes back to the way you treated the prophets before me. But you'll continue treating my people that I'm going to send to you in the same way. And
this also, I also love the fact that the chapter doesn't end on this somber note. There's a little glimmer of light.
That's right. That's right.
Tiny glimmer.
Tiny, but it's there. You got to hold on to something.
Yeah.
And it says, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. What's going on there?
Well, as we probably remember, that's exactly the verse that was shouted by the crowds at the triumphal entry. I've always had, ever since I was a new Christian and went to church for the first time on Easter when I was a senior in high school, they called it the triumphal entry, and I never could understand what was triumphal about it. It's tragic. So that's sort of a bookend with this statement here at the end of 23. You're going to have to utter that same sentiment again and mean it, understand what you're saying this time. And I think it is a glimmer of hope. I don't think it ought to be read as a guarantee of, I do believe in the future of ethnic Israel, that God will bring his people back to himself as a nation. But I don't think that is stated explicitly here. It is a glimmer of hope. And by the grace of God, we pray that God will continue to do a work in his historic people. So Israel's refusal to receive Jesus as their Messiah broke his heart. So he didn't utter those woes in a fit of pique. He wasn't just laying them out because it felt good to do it. In his heart, he was lamenting them. And so I guess I would conclude this by saying, do we have that kind of concern for people?
Another helpful and in some ways convicting part of our conversation about prophecy, prophets, and Jesus. These, what we've come to call woes in Matthew 23, are pretty clear examples of how Jesus can be seen as a prophet to Israel. And the fact that his message was rejected is not out of line with how prophets who came before him were often received. Matthew chapter 23 is an important part of understanding how Jesus was Israel's last great prophet. Well, next we're going to move on to another passage in Matthew chapter 24, in which Jesus sounds a lot like a prophet. And what he said has intrigued a lot of people throughout history, so much that they think they've been able to figure out when Jesus is going to come through on his promise to return. Have you ever tried to follow the clues to determine how close we are to when he's coming back? Matthew 24, for a lot of people, has been part of having a predicting the date of Jesus' return mindset. But is when the main thrust of this prophetic message that Jesus delivered? Let's listen.
So we're moving in this session to what is called the Olivet Discourse, Jesus speaking from the Mount of Olives. Here Jesus is speaking directly as a prophet about the future. So what do you think about these date-setting preachers? I remember way back in 1988, there was a guy named Edgar Whisenant who was a rocket scientist for NASA, who wrote a book called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. And it didn't happen in 88. So he concluded he had used the wrong calendar, so it was going to happen in 89. So he wrote another book about that.
Did he have 89 reasons for
he
that?
Did.
Okay,
He did.
Of course.
And so...
And one of them was I was wrong about the first one.
So he ended up writing a couple more books, actually. And the mission agency that published his book, they sold millions of copies. So the question is, people who are setting these dates always turn out to be wrong. So what do you think about it? How do they keep on getting a hearing? And what does any of these things have to do with being ready to meet Jesus when he finally does come at the time the Father has decided?
I think that is the irony, is the fact that there's only really one thing that Jesus made super clear about it. And that is that we won't know when the date or the time is. So pretty much as soon as someone predicts a date and time, we can now know that won't be it, because nobody knows the date and time.
Yeah.
I think this is helpful, though, because there is a aspect of prophecy that has a future-looking aspect to it, of thinking about what the implications of this whole story are for where the whole story is going.
Yeah.
I think I'm more curious about what is it about our inner workings that are drawn to these type of end time prophecies. And one of the things that has been noted is that even going back as far as Revelation, that oftentimes when people are in a sense of disorientation about the world, or a sense of just even economic, social uncertainty, like that happened after World War I, people began to feel like the world is falling apart, and they start to look for and clamor for the hope of a new the end of time more, because they're just so much angst about things that are happening. Oftentimes people are seeking for some type of respite and rescue from a sense of crisis that they feel in their world.
Not to make it too simplistic, but I just think goes back to Genesis 3 and 2 and 3, and we just want to be God. We just want to have knowledge. It gives us the experience of being in control, false though it is. We grab on to what we think will give us control.
Yeah. So anyway, when we come to Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, the disciples and Jesus are leaving the temple, and they're walking across the valley to the east to the Mount of Olives. And somewhere on that walk, the disciples, I think, want to get rid of the elephant on the sofa. So they start talking about what beautiful building that they're in. Try to relieve the tension a little bit here maybe. It was a really heavy thing you just said, Jesus, so maybe we ought to, talk about architecture for a while. He says, it's all going to be torn down. So, wow, we just can't get Jesus to be positive today at all. So they finally get serious, and they say, okay, so when is this going to happen? What's the sign of your coming of the end of the age? And interesting how they tied together these things, which would be, I guess, the destruction of the temple in 24:3, and sign of your coming and of the end of the age. So they connected the destruction of the temple to a sign of Jesus coming to the end of the age. So those three things were all one event in their mind. They didn't see past that. So let me real quickly just rush over this whole thing, like the helicopter flyover type of thing. So Jesus begins to answer their question in 24:4. And I think he begins by talking about what things will be like throughout the whole age of the church. I think that's in 24:4 to 14. I don't think he's speaking about what we would call yet the future at this point. He's talking about the way things will go for his disciples through the entire, we might say, age of the church or era of the church. Yeah. But at verse 15, he talks about the abomination of desolation going back to Daniel and the destruction of the temple and the intense persecution that is so unique, nothing like it has ever happened before or ever will happen again. So that pretty much has to be the end time, I think. So he speaks about all of the signs that lead up to that, up through verse 28. Then he describes the coming of the Son of Man in verses 29 to 31, coming on the clouds of heaven.
With the tribes of the earth, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory.
Yeah, and wow, how amazing that will be. So this is really, if we think of prophecy as simply a matter of prediction, then we have like 2/3 of this discourse left, and there's no more prediction here. From here on out, it's basically telling us how to live in light of what will happen. So, you can, synthesize it for yourself and see the main things that are going on here. He's first telling them that they need to be alert all the time, constant alertness, because the time is unknown. And that begins there, I think, right at chapter 24, verse 32, and really continues all the way into chapter 25, where we have the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. Some of them were ready to meet the Lord. They thought immediately, so they didn't bring any oil for the lamps. Others, they planned for the future, the long haul. They thought, what if the bridegroom delays? So let's take some extra oil. So constant alertness. Then the so-called parable of the talents, which isn't about spiritual gifts, but is about money, but I think stands for all the things that God gives us, all the opportunities we have, all the resources we have, our individual giftedness, and the point, of course, is being faithful, dependable, to be good managers, stewards of all that God has given us. So constant alertness leads to faithful stewardship, and then we finally have the sheep and the goats, coming of the Son of Man with all the nations arrayed like sheep and goats. There's a debate whether that's a parable or not. Doesn't really matter. The lesson is pretty clear that we need to care for people. We need to be compassionate and help the people who are in need. And it's very popular out there to say this is the way we should treat all humans, and we should. But I think this passage is about Jesus' disciples. I think if you study the way brothers and sisters and family is used in Matthew, it's speaking about fellow disciples. So I think this parable if it's a parable, is specifically about how we treat others in the body of Christ primarily, but these principles, relate to how we should treat all people.
And it really is about reflecting God and God's heart by, I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink, I was a stranger and you welcomed me, I was naked, you gave me clothing, I was sick and you took care of me, I was in prison and you visited me. All of these ways in which we reflect God by caring for others.
It really is instructive, as you said, that the primary thrust, the application of this Olivet discourse, which is very much looking at the future, whether it's near future or far
future.
Yes. and how different that is of a way to apply prophecy.
And in that way, it's really in line with all of the conversations that you've been leading us through, David, to look all the way back at the Old Testament and see how prophecy was calling people back to faithfulness to walk with God. And that's really what Jesus is doing here. He's like, hey, regardless of how things are going to end and when they're going to end, how do we live in the meantime? It's faithfulness to reflect God in the world.
Absolutely. So what we have here, I think, in this passage, and what we just looked at in Matthew is very unique because Mark and Luke also have a record of this discourse, but what they have to say basically concludes at Matthew 24:31. I mean, if you use what's called a synopsis of the Gospels, you can lay them out side by side and compare, but there's nothing at all in Mark and Luke that parallels anything from Matthew 24, verse 32 on. So all this material about how you live in light of the coming is unique to Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we made the point before, but it comes down to the fact that it's not for us to know when. That's a lost cause. So why try to figure that out?
We need to know how.
It's very clear
Yes.
how we're supposed to live until then. And if we really understand prophecy, then we'll be people of alertness, people of faithfulness, people of compassion.
Asking when about sections of prophetic scripture like this is often asking the wrong question, isn't it? It's a question that Jesus clearly said he wasn't going to answer. So that was a really helpful conversation that identified a question Jesus did answer in that Olivet discourse in Matthew 24. How should we live as we anticipate his return? And that is a question that he addressed. Well, one more part of this conversation to go, and in it we'll see that at the end of Matthew's gospel, Jesus passes the prophetic baton to someone else. Now, wait a minute. I thought we've been saying that Jesus was Israel's greatest and last prophet. Now, usually last means there's no more after, right? Well, this is a part of the conversation you need to hear to wrap up our study of prophecy, prophets, and Jesus. One, to clear that up, and two, because it really does impact you and how you live your life right now. And so after we take a moment to preview what we'll be doing in our next study, we'll take a fresh look at the Great Commission in Matthew 28. Well, next time on the Discover the Word podcast, Daniel moves over into the leadership chair to begin guiding us through an exercise routine.
So for the next 2 weeks, that's what we're going to talk about. It's training and working out, and by the end, we'll all have a different training regimen. But we're not going to talk about training physical muscles much, although maybe there'll be some overlap. But we're going to talk about training some spiritual muscles in our spiritual lives.
Yeah, because is there really any hope for you to get in shape and be more physically healthy if you don't do any exercising at all? Do we get better at anything without practice? So, does it make sense that we need to exercise and train spiritually as well? Some things that may help us to get in shape next time on the Discover the Word podcast. All right, so who did Jesus pass the prophetic baton to? Let's listen to how Elisa and Daniel and Rasul wrap up this study of prophecy, prophets, and Jesus with Dr. David Turner.
Well, it's been great to have the opportunity to share with my friends here at Our Daily Bread Ministries and speak about the background and office of Jesus as the ultimate prophet. So we would do the whole concept a disservice if we made it appear that Jesus, as Israel's last prophet, which I believe he is, left Israel without ongoing prophetic witness. And he does that through his community, the church. So when you think about the church, we find a lot of people today who are advocating for the nuclear family and thinking the nuclear family is under fire. But as you may have noticed, Jesus speaks of his disciples as his family. In fact, at the end of Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 to 50, his mother and his brothers are sort of on the outside looking in while he's teaching, and they want to talk to him. And he says, no, I'm with my family now, because my family are those who hear the word of God and do it.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the way in which the church is under fire today?
I think where I'm most sensitive to the church or the family being under attack is mostly from within. As a pastor interacting with people regularly, man, there's some rough stuff that happens in churches. A lot of tension, disagreement, accidental hurting of one another, intentional hurting of one another. So that's where my mind goes immediately.
Yeah, I hear you, Daniel, although there, of course, is as well external. But one thing I think about is the ranking of priorities. And in America, with our me-isms, everything's about the individual. It kind of feeds that. And I've been struck just by a lot of our conversations around this table, how God really calls us to a communal way of living together as his family.
Yes.
So, because Daniel, what you're saying, that internal conflict often comes as an expression of all about me and my family and my needs and what time the services are and if I can get my kid, and all of that. And what are you doing for the youth and my beliefs, and instead of growing together. So I see that also as an issue.
Yeah, I think about the spiritual basis of attack, and even when Jesus says, I will build my church and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, and the ways in which the enemy oftentimes fosters division in the church, which is an attack on God's family. And that, to your point, Daniel, about a lot of that coming from within, that we have to be vigilant about the unity of the fellowship of the saints.
So we want to draw together several passages here today. We already alluded to Matthew 12, 46 to 50, but we're trying to unpack what it means for the church to be a prophetic community today. And I wonder if one of you would read the last beatitude in Matthew, back in chapter 5, verses 10 through 12.
I have that. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
So we're noticing here that when Christians are treated poorly because of their faith, when the church is persecuted, there's history for that. There's history for that in two stages. There's the whole history of prophets being rejected, which we just looked at in Matthew 23. And there's the testimony of Jesus, which is being rejected, which we also saw in chapter 23. So I think the point here is, so they rejected the prophets who were before you. I think that implies that we're prophets, that there is a prophetic witness that the church as a community bears. I'm not speaking here about the spiritual gifts and prophecy that Paul speaks about in 1 Corinthians 12 to 14. I know there's lots of controversy about that. I don't want to get into that today one way or the other. But I just want to say the church has a prophetic voice as a community. And within the church, different people are gifted in different ways to be a part of that choir, I guess, have different voices on the same music there. So chapter 10 in Matthew is a very sobering chapter, when Jesus says he will send out the disciples. And the picture isn't pretty there about what they will have to endure for his name's sake. And can I call your attention to verse 41 there in chapter 10? The one who receives a prophet because he is a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. So that seems to connect again the idea that the ministry that's being carried out by the disciples is a prophetic ministry.
I also love in that particular passage what an example of that could be. Whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. Sometimes we think about these big things we need to do for God.
Right.
And I love this example of the most practical, simple possible thing you could do. Someone's thirsty and you give them a cup of cold water.
And it reminds me of when the people asked John the Baptist, this great prophet, well, what should we do? Because the kingdom of heaven is here. Hey, you who are stealing, stop. You know what I mean? you who are exploiting or being like, so there's always this ethical expectation of what to do with these prophetic words.
Yeah. So we've shown that the church is a prophetic community in Matthew.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So let's go to the end. Let's go to Matthew 28, which is the end of Matthew, but it's the beginning for the church.
Yes.
And so the whole concept of prophetic witness to Israel and to the world is not over just because Jesus was crucified and rose again and went to heaven. Jesus is still active in his church through the Holy Spirit, and Jesus sends us to continue his mission. So I just want to call your attention to Matthew 28:18-20, which I think is a familiar passage, but I want to show you how this passage takes us all the way back to Deuteronomy 18.
Do you want us to read the 18 through 20 first?
Go ahead.
Happy to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so Matthew 28, verse 18-20. Then Jesus came to them, the disciples. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age.
You'll notice here in verse 20 where it says, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. Now that echoes very clearly, I think, the phrase in Deuteronomy chapter 18, where it says the prophet like Moses will preach to Israel everything that God has commanded. And if you don't listen to that, you'll be held accountable. So this is what's called a prophetic commissioning scene. I think it helps us because this language about commanding them to observe everything that I have told you ties us not only to this text in Deuteronomy 18, but also to the commissioning of Joshua to be Moses' successor. You can find this in Jeremiah chapter 1, where Jeremiah speaks of how God called him. And you can find in Ezekiel as well this same language that this person is commissioned to command, to teach everything that God has commanded him. And so what is happening here with this great commission to the church is Jesus is the prophet who is passing on his prophetic mission to his successors, and the church is to teach everything that Jesus commanded, not to leave anything out, not to add anything new, and to call people to obedience. So this is our task as the church. We know that it's not going to be an easy task, because Jesus told us back in chapter 23 how the people he sends will be persecuted, but the baton is now being passed to us. So everything that we've learned about Jesus, the prophet, now becomes our resume as well.
Yeah.
So are we going to be like Jesus, not just in some of our personal characteristics, but in our life being mission directed?
Man, that's so good.
I mean, I'm sitting here like, I've heard, read, taught, quoted the Great Commission more times than I can count, and I never saw the echoes of Deuteronomy 18 and seeing that. So I got to ask you this. So, what are the implications for reading and understanding the Great Commission as a prophetic commissioning scene in light of all the other passages that we've seen about this ethical dimension?
Well, that's part of what Jesus has commanded. I mean, he's not only commanded us how to treat people, he's modeled to us how to treat people. So we need to be like him in our personal relationships. But at the same time, we're, not to break off the bent reed or put out the smoldering wick, Isaiah 42, Matthew 12. But we are to treat them well as we give them the prophetic message. And it may indeed be a message of woe, but it may be a message of encouragement, depending upon where their heart. Maybe they need to hear the woe. And a prophet of God who is led by the Holy Spirit will know how to handle different people depending upon where their hearts are.
Thank you so much for coming and showing us that.
Well, thanks. It's been a blessing to think with all you guys, and I mean it. Thank you.
Yeah, I hope you've come to appreciate Dr. David Turner as much as we do. What a great 2 episodes we've spent around the table exploring the subject of prophecy, prophets, and Jesus. And all that conversation that led us to that way of thinking, that, what did he call it, the prophetic commissioning scene in Matthew 28 that we used so often call the Great Commission. Yeah, that was a meaningful way to wrap up this series. Lisa Morgan, Daniel Ryan Day, Rasul Berry, and of course, Dr. David Turner, your study partners for the last 2 episodes of the Discover the Word podcast. Discover the Word is Bible engagement in the form of a small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and always point us to discover Jesus in the pages of the Bible. And as we wrap up this episode, just want to encourage you to consider helping us multiply what matters. Now, Discover the Word is part of Our Daily Bread Ministries, and we are intent on fueling a global Bible engagement movement. And when you partner with us, whether through prayer, financial gifts, or just spreading the word about our resources, then you are making it possible for us to continue connecting people with the Bible and the life-changing story of Jesus around the world. To partner with us financially, you can go to discovertheword.org, our website, discovertheword.org, and click the Donate button that's up at the top of the page. Well, thanks for listening. I'm Brian Hettinga. Discover the Word is provided by Our Daily Bread Ministries.